My, what do we have here? We're back in the Torque-a-Lot garage with my oh-so-sexy assistant Adam underneath his Honda Civic. Getting oil all over my floor probably. And we're back to work on the F20b. Doing exciting stuff. Putting main studs in. Nothing much to see here really. Just running some threads down in the holes. That's it. The excitement is building. Right, Adam? He says, hell yeah. Don't forget your lube. Lube's always important. In case anybody's wondering, the main studs are not totally necessary for the power that I'm aiming for, but considering the cost of a new set of the factory main bolts, I just opted for the studs. Now usually if you're going to torque studs down to ARP specs, then you need to get the main caps and the block line honed with the studs installed. So you put all the studs in, you know, take it to a machine shop with the engine girdle and the caps. The machine shop will torque everything down to ARP specs, measure out the bearing clearances, and then they'll actually take the main caps off and the girdle and shave a little bit of material off of them, put them back on, and then run a big hone through it with these torqued to ARP specs, so you get exactly the bearing clearance that you need. That is if you torque them down to ARP specs. If you don't, if you're only torquing these down to stock specs, then that's not really needed. But like I said, they are a little pointless if you are just going to use them to stock specs, but it's not going to hurt anything, and the cost between the ARP studs and the factory fasteners, it's such a minuscule difference that there's really no point in just buying the stock ones. But like I said, you cannot use these. I think the spec, I have to look at the sheet, but I think it's around 85 foot-pounds. You cannot torque these down to 85 foot-pounds without getting the mains line honed. Now, I know some people call having the cylinder bores honed line honing, but that is incorrect. That's not what a line hone is. A line hone is when you run a boring bar horizontally through a series of caps. The same thing would happen if you had messed up one of your caps on your cylinder head and you had to replace it. Technically, you can't just replace one cap. You have, well, if you do, you have to get all of them line honed in that side. So, you know, it can be just because the bearing clearances actually are the same on the new cap you got, doesn't mean they're in line with the rest of them. So you really have to take that to a machine shop and get it line honed if you ever mess up one of your cam caps and have to replace it. I know some people don't, and they're okay, and they run lots of miles on them, and they never have a problem, and that's good for them. Oh shit, wrong side. That's good for them, but you know, that's called an anecdotal fallacy, and just because it works for you doesn't mean it's okay. We're back with a exciting video in the Torx a Lot garage. My lovely assistant Adam is over there still racing out his Civic. I'm putting the main bearings in. I have the first 4 in. They all go in the same, but I figured I'd make this quick little video on how to actually put main bearings in. If you look at the back of the bearing, there's a little tab. Let's see if I can get it to focus. Now that matches up with a little cutout in the actual main on the block, and all you do is put the tab in the little notch and push the other side of the bearing down, and that's it, and then they're flush. And repeat the same process with the caps that are now pressed into the girdle. I got to put the main bearings in this. Clean these out real good first with denatured alcohol before putting the bearings in. Probably have to swap a couple of them around to get the clearances the way I want them, but never know, I might get lucky and they might all be perfect. Alright, here comes the next step. I've got the main bearings in the block. I've got the main bearings in the bearing caps pressed into the girdle. I've got my, you don't need gloves, it's not dirty. I got my lovely assistant Adam over here. Here's his shoes. He's going to assist me in putting the F23 crank down on these bearings without dropping it and messing them all up. Try not to drop too many F-bombs. YouTube doesn't like that. Okay, so you take that end. You're only going to have that little knobber to work with. Try not to bang up my... Doesn't matter what position you put it in. Just once it's down, don't turn it. If you turn it dry, that is bad news bears. So once you drop it in there, just leave her alone. Actually, I'm gonna pick this up and turn it just a tiny bit. I got a couple of. Okay. Just had to turn it a little bit so I could lay my plastic gauge across without it being in the oil passages. If you're wondering what that white schmoo was, that's leftovers from having this balanced at the machine shop. It's the grease they use on the machine. Right now I'm just sizing this. I wiped the mains off. Everything's clean. But I'm going to give it one last clean before I actually put it together for good. Obviously, I have to grease it up anyway before I tighten it down and torque everything down to spec. But all right, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to drop my plastic gauge strips on and start torquing the mains down. All right, we're back. Going to torque the mains and the girdle down. Forgot to mention I'm using green plastic gauge by Clevite. The Honda OEM spec for main clearances. This is an F23 crank, but that doesn't matter. It's still 55 millimeter mains, just like a H22A4, just like an F20b. So that part doesn't matter. But the Honda OEM spec is 11 thousandths to 21 thousandths. Now this is for a turbo build, so I'm hoping for a little bit looser. Maybe 15 to 20 would be better than the 11 to 15. So we'll see what happens when I get that far. Using the factory shop manual on page 726, which is 7, of course, is for engine mechanical, page 26. It gives you the proper torque sequence and the proper torque numbers, which is 22 foot-pounds to begin with and ending at 54. You can see I've marked down the sequence for torquing it down, which is, of course, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7's over here, 8, 9, and 10. That's the order in which they're torqued down. I've already got my torque wrench set. It's kind of hard to see. Yeah, it doesn't want to focus. It's set to 22 foot-pounds to begin with, so that's where we're going to start. Click. Click. If you're wondering how tight 22 foot-pounds is without a torque wrench, it's about a half a grunt. So if you actually grunted, you went too far. Alright, now I got to turn the wrench up to 54 foot-pounds. Just double check. 54. 54 pound-foot, and then where are we here? This is 50, 2, 3, 4. Torque sequence over again. And at 54 pound-foot, you're definitely getting into the grunt territory. And don't forget, you have to use your ARP lube with ARP studs, so the torque is correct. That's it. Okay, they're all torqued down. I'm going to stop the video now, take them back off, take the mains and the girdle off, and check my plastic gauge strips and see where I'm at. Okay, so I got the mains back off. I just measured my plastic gauge strips. Probably a little too dark in here to see the actual measurements, and it doesn't help that some of them actually stuck to the bearings rather than staying stuck to the crank. But I'm seeing 15 thousandths, 15 thousandths, 15 thousandths, 15 thousandths, and number 5 is between 15 and 20. I want to say closer to like 17 thousandths. It's kind of hard to tell. The the strips only give you 1 thousandths, 1.5, 2 thousandths, and 3. So they're not really any more accurate than that. So I'm going to clean this up, take the crank out, wipe it back down, wipe the bearings off, and lube it up, and throw the girdle and the mains back on, and torque them down for good. And once I throw some lube on, then I can spin it and see how actually free the crank rotates. So I'm going to stop it there, and I'm going to do that. I would record it, but there's really nothing to see other than me pulling this crank off and wiping it off, and nobody really wants to sit around and watch a cleaning video. I'm sure we all know how to do that. Okay, we are back. I'm re-recording this video. I recorded one yesterday, but I didn't like the way it turned out, so I'm doing it over again. I already have piston 1 dropped in the cylinder. I'll do piston 2 in this video, but this is 2 weeks since the last segment of this video. My friend Adam is no longer here, racing out his Civic in the background, so I'm all by my lonesome. I have my heater running again in the background. That's the annoying whine that you hear. While it's been in the 50s by the garage mahal here, it's the garage is sitting on a big slab of concrete, so even though it's 50 degrees outside, it's still pretty cold in the garage. So I have my waste oil burner cooking away, so hopefully it'll warm up in here in a couple minutes. The things I went over in the video that I'm redoing, there's a couple things I wanted to touch base on. Let me lock this block in. There. One of the things that I see in a lot of videos, and you've probably seen them too, is people building engines, especially Honda engines, and they don't check the clearances on their rod bearings. I don't understand the mindset of not checking the clearances on the rod bearings, and on an H22 it is a pain in the ass because the big girdle is in the way, and it can be quite problematic to reach all of the rod bolts, especially on cylinder 4. That one can be quite troubling to get to. But knowing your rod bolt or your rod bearing clearance, it's just as important as knowing your crank clearance, especially if you're building an engine that you want to last. Some people will just say, you know, run it as loose as you can and run the thickest oil that you can find in it. Now that's fine in an engine that's, you know, a race engine, and you're going to tear it apart every couple of weeks. And something that you're going to drive around a lot, that's not really the best mindset to be in. And one of the reasons for that is, especially in Honda engines, there's no bearings in the cylinder head for the cams. The cams ride in, you know, journal machined directly into the aluminum. That clearance isn't going to change. It doesn't matter what you do to the bottom end. The clearance on the camshaft is still going to be what Honda built it to, or close. You know, I mean, you've been driving it, so there's going to be somewhere, but there's not going to be, you know, 2,000ths clearance. And where running a thick oil will come in as problematic is it's not going to make it into that cam journal and properly lubricate the camshafts. And what's going to happen is eventually you're going to burn those up. So you really want to keep your bearing clearances fairly close to a Honda spec. Now, like I said earlier in this video, my main bearings, they're all plastic gauged out. They were 15 thousandths, 15 thousandths, 15 thousandths, 15, and 17. That's all within spec. Honda spec is 10 thousandths, or if you prefer 1,000th, to 2,000. So 10 thousandths to 20 thousandths, if you want to call it that. So 15 is pretty much right on the money. And if you're wondering what bearings I'm using, now this is an F20b block, but it's an an F23 crank, because the F23 is the biggest stroke that you can get from a factory crank that'll drop right into this block without having to machine the crank. You can use a K24 crank, but it does require machining. The snout of the crank is different. The end of the crank where the flywheel bolts on is different. They both require machining, and some of it can be quite expensive. But the F23 crank is only 2 millimeters shorter at 97 millimeter stroke, so it's not really that much of a difference in the amount of torque that you're going to get out of it. Going from the 88 millimeter F20b stroke to the 97 millimeter F23 stroke is going to increase bottom end torque quite a bit. It's going to decrease how fast I can rev the engine, but you know, I'm going to be driving this around on the street, so I'm not going to want to rev it out to, you know, 8,500, 9,000 RPM wherever I go. So, you know, if I can rev this out to 7,000 RPM and have a nice fat power curve, I'm more than happy with that. If I was building a track car, then sure, I'd want to be able to rev it and keep it revved longer, so I would have kept the F20b crank in there. But for driving it on the street, I don't see any reason why I would want something that I was going to rev out. But that being said, the bearings that I'm using for this build are the King Racing bearings. It's the full set for the F23. So the part numbers are there for anybody that's interested. Therefore, the Honda D Series F23A, F23Z, and K20A3, and the same goes with the rod bearings. They're the same They're for the same engines. And the reason the K20 is listed on there is the K series and the F23 share the same rod width. H series, H22 and F20b, they're all a little wider. But as we know, K series can make plenty of power on its, slightly narrower connecting rods. So I'm not too concerned. These are forged connecting rods, and they'll be more than enough for what I'm shooting for. But back on topic of making sure you know what your rod bearing clearances are, you need to know that information so you know what oil to use. Because manufacturer spec is based on bearing clearances for the most part. I mean, other things come into play, obviously, as well as where you're living, what oil you choose also makes a difference. So you'll want to keep that in mind as well when you're selecting an oil, but you definitely need to know all your clearances, not just the crank. The other thing I wanted to touch base on is torque specs for your rod bolts. Let's see if I can get this in here. I might need to... Yeah, I'm going to have to move that down. Oop. I knocked my plastic gauge off. That's alright. I got one. Torque specs for your rod bolts. If you're using ARP fasteners, they not only have a a specific number. In the case of the rod bolts that came with these rods, it's 40 to 45 foot-pounds. But there's another spec that goes with that, and most people ignore this, and it should not be ignored. There's also a stretch limit on the bolts. Now, bolts are 40 to 45 foot-pounds, and the stretch limit is 5 to 6 thousandths. You want to clamp your rods without the bearings in them, torque the bolts down. I actually make a tool called a connecting rod clamp. You can also use a bench vise if it's big enough and you have clearance underneath, and you put something in the jaws to connect the to protect the rod surface itself. You don't want to booger it all up with their coarse jaws. But the reason you want to clamp it down is you have to clamp it here across this surface. You don't want to clamp a rod down here and then torque on it, because you're going to start, even if you can't see it, you're going to start twisting that rod around and you're going to weaken it. You don't want to do that. But you want to clamp the rod down and torque the bolts down. Start at the lowest spec they're set to. So start at in my case it was 40 foot-pounds. Start there and work your way up, and at the same time measure how far the bolts stretch. Now you can do that. They actually make a tool that you fit a dial indicator in. You place the tool here. I don't have one, but you place the tool over the bolt like that after you torque it down to whatever you torqued it to, and it'll tell you how much it stretched. You measure it first, torque it, and then measure it again, and it'll tell you how much you've stretched the bolt. Because you want to know that you're not weakening that fastener. Because a fastener, any fastener, not just rod bolts, but any fastener in general is a inclined plane in a circle or a spiral and a spring. Now, if you know, or anybody should know, that if you overstretch a spring, stretch a spring, you'll weaken it. And the same thing will happen to a fastener. Even if you didn't strip the threads out, that doesn't mean that you didn't weaken the fastener. So what you want to do is keep torquing that bolt down and checking the stretch until you get to the manufacturer's spec on how much that bolt should stretch. And then you want to stop. I tested these rod bolts. I measured them out. I actually used a caliper and a pre-measured piece of metal dropped inside the hole to sit on top of the rod bolt so I could measure how much it stretched after I torqued it down. And at 40 foot-pounds, it was 5/1000ths of an inch stretch. That's perfect. I'm not tightening them down any more than that. Some people will go, oh, well, it's 42, 45 foot-pounds is the spec. So I'm just going to set it to that. Let's see if I can get that cam cap in there. I'm just going to set it to that and forget about it. The problem with that is 45 might be too much. They're giving you a window of torque for the limit of the stretch. So you want to know where your bolt is stretching without over torquing it. Because if you over torque that bolt and you overstretch it past its limit, you got to throw it out. It's a weak bolt now. It's either going to fall out or it's going to snap, and you don't want either of those things happening. The other thing I wanted to go over, I know earlier in maybe my first video, I said where I was putting the ring gaps on the pistons. I think I said I was going to have them at 12 o'clock for the top ring, 6 o'clock for the bottom ring, and then like I want to say like 4:30 and 7:30 for the oil rings. The problem with that is, as I was going through the shop manual, I have an actual shop manual, not a a Chilton's or a Haynes, but a real Honda shop manual. It specifically states, do not position any ring gap at piston thrust surfaces. Do not position any ring gap in line with the wrist pin hole. Now, the second part, that's obvious. You don't want to put the ring gaps in line with the wrist pin hole. But the thrust surfaces are The thrust surfaces are 12 and 6 o'clock. So obviously, if that's the case, you can't put your ring gaps at 12 and 6. Where is it? You can't put them at 12 and 6. It's if it specifically calls that out in the shop manual when replacing pistons, you don't want to do that. They have a reason for telling you that. That's best if you follow their guidelines. What else was I going to say? I forgot what else I went over. But so I'm going to pause the video here, get that cap on, get everything back into place and check my bearing clearance. And I have to do that one at a time. Now, I have to fit the cap on there, rotate the crank back into position, and then tighten it down. But I don't want to rotate the crank with the bearing cap resting directly on it. That's no good. So after I check the bearing clearance, you know, I have to wipe the crank back off, grease it up, torque the cap down for good, and then move to the next piston. So what I'm going to do now is, because my head's going to be in the way, so I'm going to pause the video, get that cap on, get another piece of plastic gauge. It's green plastic gauge, by the way. The spec for the rod clearance, or the rod bearing clearance, is the same for the rods as it is for the cranks. So 1/1000 to 2/1000. So that would be green plastic gauge. So let me do that, and when I take the cap back off, I'll restart the video so we can see what the clearance is. Alright, it's only been a couple minutes. I've got the cap resting in place, plastic gauge underneath it, the rod pulled back up into position. I only needed to turn the crank a couple more degrees from top dead center so I could slip the cap in there. But I'm going to tighten it down. And just like anything else, you want to start light and go heavy. So this is 40 foot-pounds, so I'm going to start at 20 and then work my way to 40. But you don't want to just crank on one side until it's 20, crank on the other side until it's 20. You know, you want to work your way back and forth. Like this one isn't even. And you always want to use with ARP fasteners, you always want to use fastener assembly lube. Sometimes the parts you get will come with them, like my main studs came with a little pack of assembly lube with them, but you always want to use that because their torque specs are for that lube. So if you're not using that lube, the torque's going to be different. I think the rod manufacturer said if you use engine oil, if you use 10W30 engine oil, it's 10 foot-pounds more. So instead of 40, it'd be 50. But because I have the ARP assembly loop, I'm torquing them down to 40, and going to call it a day at that. So first, get these snugged up. That one's bottomed out. Alright. Should be there soon. 20. 20. Okay. Focus. 40. Lock it down. And just like for 20, you want to go back and forth. A little bit at a time. $40. 40. All right. Now we're going to loosen these main cap bolts up. Don't use the torque wrench for that. So whenever you're done using a torque wrench, even if it's for a couple of minutes, unlock the handle and back the pressure off. You can knock the calibration out real quick, leaving a torque wrench tight all the time. But like I said, don't use the torque wrench to loosen a fastener. They're not made for that. The reason they you know, have a toggle so you can go either way is because not all bolts are right-handed. So some bolts are left-handed thread, and if they need to be torqued down, you need to be able to turn them counterclockwise. So we're going to use a regular wrench. One side at a time, loosen them up a little bit at a time until they they're, you know, just finger tight. And then now the trick is rods. What you want to do is back the fastener all the way out, okay, and then thread it back in a little bit, and you'll see why in a second. Back it all the way out, lift it up to see if it's loose. Thread it back down a little bit. Now you might be going, why the hell do you want to do that? Because we have to be able to get those rods apart. Get the cap off of the rod. It can be a little difficult if you take the bolt all the way out. So instead we use the bolt, separate them. Take the fastener out. Try not to move the cap around too much because plastic gauge is under that cap. Now I'm going to pause it, push the rod out of the way, pick the cap up with one hand, rotate the engine until I can get the cap off, take it off, and then check the clearance. I'm hoping that the plastic gauge stuck to the cap, the bearing in the cap and not the crank, so then I can, you know, really show you what it is. But alright, we'll pause it. Alright, I have the cap off. Measured the bearing clearance already, but I'll try to do it on screen. As you can tell, I've zoomed in a little bit. Unfortunately, the piece of plastic gauge did not stick to the bearing, so it's still on the crank itself. So what we're going to do is slide the scale in here. Try not to get my big fat head in the way. As you can tell, it is, it's hard to see, I don't know if there's a lot of glare. It's slightly narrower than the 15 thousandths or 1.5, if you want to say it that way, but it's slightly narrower than that, but thicker than 2/1000ths, which means if you look at the scale, if it's narrower than 15 but wider than 2, that means it's in between there somewhere, which is still within spec. That's perfectly fine. You know, like I said, Honda's spec is between 1 and 2. 1, I wouldn't want to be there. That'd be way too tight, especially for a turbo build, because you want a little bit of oil in there, taking the beating from that extra power from that explosion, from all the extra fuel and air that a turbo will put into a combustion chamber. So you want a little thicker oil in there to take that pounding. So you definitely wouldn't want 1/1000th clearance in there. But between 15 or 1.5 thousandths and 2/1000ths, that's perfect. That's great. That's where I was hoping they would be. So I'm going to clean this off, the residue. I got to clean it off the. Yeah, let's show the bearing as well. See, there's a little bit of. You want to wipe that off of there. I'm going to clean it off the crank. Put assembly lube on the bearings, and then torque this cylinder or this rod down for good, and then move to cylinder 2. And I'll start recording while I'm dropping cylinder number 2 in, or piston number 2 into cylinder number 2. All right, we've got piston number 1, cylinder number 1, rod number 1 torqued down. That's not coming back off again. Forgot to mention, make sure when you're putting it together for the final time, remember we marked arrows on the caps so we know which way to put them when we're putting everything together. Arrow to the intake side, which is now over here. These notches that the little tangs on the bearings fit into go on the exhaust side. Alright, we're going to flip this over. Going to turn it over. Oh yeah, nice and smooth. You want to turn it over a couple of times. That'll line everything up a little bit, and it'll also, you want to do it after every piston. So you know, if you have one that's binding up, you'll know which one it is. If, you know, you did the first 2, turned it over, everything was fine. You know, you did 1, turned it over, did the second one, turned it over, did the third one, and it won't turn, or it's really hard, then you'll know it's a problem with the third one. If you do all 4 and then try to turn it over and it doesn't turn over, or it's tough, you won't know which one it is, and you'll have to take them all back apart. So it's much easier if you do it one at a time, and I should actually be able to do it by hand. So there we go. Oh yeah. Good suction on that. All right, so we're going to rotate this. That's top dead center for cylinder 2. It's bottom dead center. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to pause it. Going to clean the cap off. Make sure there isn't any residual oil or anything on there. Nice and clean. We'll do the same for the bearing. This is denatured alcohol, if you're wondering what I'm using to clean these off. You can use brake cleaner too. Some people use that, but in the long run, denatured alcohol is cheaper than buying, you know, a whole bunch of cans of brake clean. Especially make sure that the back is nice and cleaned off. You're wondering what these are. These are actually my son's old bibs. He doesn't use them anymore. I cleaned them up and use them out in the garage. They come in handy because you can hang them up. So you don't have to lay them down on a dirty work surface. You can hang them up on a hook and you're not going to get crud all over them while you're not using them. Just like the main bearings, line the tang up with the groove. Drop it in place. The cap is done. Now we're going to do the rod. Make your alcohol. Clean that out real good. Same thing with the bearing. Clean all the schmoo off of there. I'm going to make sure the mating surface, the back side, is really clean. I keep the bearings in the package until I'm ready to take them out and drop them in. The only ones that that doesn't apply to are the ones the set the machine shop took out when they balanced my rotating assembly. Alright, very nice and clean. Hang our towel up. This is, you know, they say doing stuff on camera and trying to record it makes everything take longer, and they're not lying. Trying to do this on camera so everybody can see what I'm doing definitely takes more time. Alright, so bearings in the rod. One thing to note before you drop the rod in is you want to make sure that it's fairly centered on your wrist pin. Obviously you should be able to slide it back and forth and move it like this. If you can't, you have problems, and you need to address those before you start trying to assemble the engine. But Make sure it's mostly centered. If it's off a little bit, you can still maneuver it around once you drop it in. But these are a pain in the ass to work with. They do work though. Okay. Get your ring compressor ready. You want to oil those up. So I'm actually using a gear lube. Adam left it here. He went to go look in an Eclipse or something like that. Whoa! That had a transmission leak. The damn thing just unlocked on me. That's alright. So he bought a bunch of gear lube. He never ended up buying the car, but he left all the oil here for me to use as I see fit. And it works fine. It's nice and heavy. It doesn't just, run off when you put it in there. I'm going to tighten this back up a little bit. Like I said, these are a bit of a pain in the ass. But they're common, and they're cheap. So that's why I wanted to buy these for making these videos. These are things that you can buy these at a parts store. And a lot of people who are watching these are doing this on a budget. I'm doing it on a budget, but I wanted to make sure that when I do things like this, it applies to other people as well. Not everybody's going to want to go out and spend the I don't know if they're $50 or $60 for the sized Wiseco ring compressors that you just drop them in. They make everything much easier, but not everybody's going to want to go do that. And if you're going to build more than one engine, chances are they're not going to have they're going to have more than one size, so you're going to need to buy those for every single size piston. Whereas the spring-loaded ones, they're adjustable. They're just a bit more of a pain in the ass to work with. And if you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm moving my ring gaps around. So like I said, do not put the ring gaps at the thrust surface. So not at 12 and 6. So right now, this is the top ring. And that's the second ring. I want to make those about 180 degrees off from each other. The oil rings don't matter as much. You still don't want them in line with the pin bore. But as far as, maybe I don't want that one. See, these are pretty close. This is the second ring, and it's really hard to see, but the gap for the oil ring, the top oil ring, is right here. They're pretty close together. So I'm going to move that ring around a little bit, the oil ring, so they don't line up as closely. And like I said, the oil ring, it's not as critical for placement. You just don't want them, both the oil rings lined up. So, okay. We should be good. And the rings are going to shift around anyway when you're breaking it in and setting the rings. They're going to move. They don't stay exactly where you put them. But they'll be close. And, you want them fairly close before you drop them in. Don't tighten it down all the way just yet. You want to make sure that the bottom of your skirt is hanging out. That'll help you index it in the cylinder bore much easier than trying to do it by cranking this down all the way first. So now that we have the skirt hanging out, all right, the ring clamp is tight. Try to keep that rod fairly close to center on the wrist pin. Make sure your crank for the cylinder that you're working on is at bottom dead center. If you have rods that are studded, so the studs are sticking out, you want to put like a piece of tubing over that stud, so when you drop the rod in, the stud doesn't hit your crank, because it could ruin your crank. So you want to protect the crank for that sort of thing. But these are not studded rods; they have regular ARP fasteners. So we're gonna drop this in the hole without playing bumper cars with the cylinder walls. Make sure the arrow is pointed up. These are nice. These pistons have the recess cut out, and it's in a fairly straight line. So you just want to make sure once you have one in, that you line the rest of them up, and they should drop right in, and you shouldn't have any problems having to try to twist the rod to get it to line up with the crank. Going to my hammer, wipe some of the schmoo off my hands first so I don't drop the hammer onto my block. Like that. Use the rubber end, not the business end. Size of the hammer doesn't really matter, but you know, a heavier one will make it easier on you. This is a 32 ounce and it works just fine for this. Apply pressure to the ring compressor as you're hitting the piston down, because you don't want one of the rings to pop out underneath the compressor and hang up on the top of the cylinder. Especially if you didn't know it happened, because if you're pounding down on that ring, you're going to damage the ring, you might damage the piston, and you might damage the cylinder wall as well. So make sure you put plenty of pressure, downward pressure on the ring compressor. And if it does pop up, make sure the easiest thing to do if it does pop up is to just pull it out and start over again, because you want to be sure that you don't damage any of the rings or the piston. The rings are replaceable; they're fairly cheap, but the pistons are kind of expensive. I think each one of these pistons is about 170 a piece, give or take. So you definitely want to make sure that you don't, throw that much money away from a stupid mistake like pounding on one of the piston rings. So we'll knock this in. There we go. One's in. And it looks like it twisted a little bit, but we'll be able to take care of that. Rotate her over. Put the pin back in. And now we're back where we started with cylinder 1, except on cylinder 2. So I'm going to stop the video there. don't know if I'm going to get these all done today. But hopefully I'll get them done today. But if not, I'll come back in tomorrow and finish them up. So you guys have a good day. And hopefully I'll be able to record more of this video with all of them in, but I'm not counting on it. At least not today anyway. Alright, I just got done checking the bearing clearance on cylinder number 2 connecting rod. That came out almost exactly the same as cylinder number 1. I'd say they're both around 17 thousandths, or 1.7 if you want to say it like that. They both turn over effortlessly. As you can tell, I've now turned off my heater. It's quite warm out here now. That thing heats up my big garage fairly quickly. I can no longer, I guess I can turn it a little bit by hand, but no effort at all with a wrench. So I'm going to move on to cylinder number 3. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention one thing. I don't know if I covered it in any of my other videos, or even the beginning of this video, I'm not sure. A very important O-ring that some people miss or reuse, right under here, the center main cap has an O-ring between the cap and the girdle that needs to be replaced. There definitely needs to be one in there. Without that, you'll have barely any oil pressure. It's a very critical O-ring to have. You know, some of the ones on the external part of the engine, if you don't have them or you reuse them, it'll just leak oil and be a pain in the ass. But without that O-ring that sits right between the center cap and the girdle, not only are you going to have low oil pressure, but you're going to start starving your bearings and you're going to burn them up real quick. So you definitely want to make sure that that O-ring is a fresh one and that you put it there at all. All right, that's it for now. I'm going to see if I can get the last 2 cylinders done before my son wakes up from his nap, but I'm not going to count on it. He's already been asleep for 2.5 hours, so any moment now he'll be waking up. Surprisingly enough, I was able to get all 4 pistons in. Check the clearance on all of the rod bearings. They're basically the exact same across the board, somewhere between 15 and 20 thousandths. I put a little bit of oil in there just to keep the cylinders from getting beat up from me turning it around, but I'll wipe off a majority of that. But everything turns nice and smooth. There's absolutely no binding at all. The noise that you hear when I turn it around is just the the ring sweeping up and down the cylinders. But other than that, everything is perfect how it should be. Let me just roll it over real quick and I'll show you how I had to turn the crank to get the last rod bearing sized and everything. Let's see how. Now, right now, so this is bottom dead center on cylinder 4. obviously, because of the shape of the girdle, you're not going to get the cap in there. So what I had to do was I had to turn the crank until it was about there. Might have even been a little further than that. Pull the rod up, butt it up against the crank, put the cap in, and then sort of rotate it into place. Dropped it down. Torqued everything down, pulled it back off, checked the clearance. It was the exact same as the rest of them. And that's one of the reasons I chose the King XP racing bearings anyways. They have a reputation for really tight tolerances when they're making the bearings, which will of course translate into everything being almost exactly the same when you put them together, which is very helpful. Although on that same line, some bearing manufacturers with their variance in thickness, even when you're using a standard size bearing, if you have one rod or one main that's a little tight and one that's a little loose, you can try swapping those bearings around and try to get everything even. But if all of the bearings in the set are exactly the same, like King has a reputation of being, then moving the bearings around isn't going to really help your cause. You can try, but chances are it won't make any difference. But like I said, I had to turn the crank. It's probably, if bottom dead center was 12 o'clock, the crank is probably right around 2 o'clock that I had to rotate it in order to fit the cap in under the girdle and check the clearances and everything. So I'm going to end this video here. I have a couple of hours worth of video that I probably have to go through and try to shorten up to a length that people will actually watch. So I'm not going to do anything else with the block in this video. I'm actually not going to do anything else in this video. So probably the next time we come back, I'll be working, swapping the internals out for my new oil pump, the one that you saw me do the balance shaft delete on. I'll be putting the F20b oil pump internals in this oil pump, only because I don't trust what the cheap manufacturers use. So I'd rather have, even if it's a Honda OEM internals with 40,000 miles on them, I'd rather have that than a brand new one that's, you know, made out of cheap components. So like I said, I'm going to end it here. I'm going to go in and have some lunch. My son actually stayed asleep the whole time, so he should be up very soon. So maybe I'll just wake him up. He's been asleep for 3 hours, 3+ hours now. So, all right, you guys have a good day, and I'll see you next time.